Well, Julian Assange has been thrown a temporary legal lifeline, with the British High Court delaying an immediate extradition to the US by at least 3 more weeks. Two of the court's justices said they couldn't make a final decision on the WikiLeaks founder's bid to appeal until certain assurances from the US were made. Well, joining me now is human rights lawyer and his former legal advisor, Geoffrey Robertson, KC. Mr. Robertson, thank you very much for your time coming to us from London, morning, of course, where you are. What are your concerns about how this case is playing out?
Well, they've been concerns for a long time. Julian Assange spent 8 years in the embassy of Ecuador, and a further 5 years, not at his volition, in a prison that is usually used for terrorist suspects. He's not well, and it would have been more effective in terms of British justice had he been dealt with a long time ago. His first hearing, he was judged to be at risk of suicide if he was to be extradited to America, and that was overturned on appeal. Yesterday, if he'd been turned down, he could have been on a plane to New York, but as luck would have it for him, the court decided in his favor that he had 3 strongly arguable grounds of appeal. And then it did something very interesting. It demanded that if America was to be effective, successful, it would have to guarantee that Julian would not be subject to the death penalty. I think that's easy for it to do. But also, and this is the interesting bit, that he would not be discriminated against because he was an Australian, a non-American, and he would have the full force, as Americans have, of the First Amendment, which secures press freedom in America. So that is very interesting, and the American lawyers may have some difficulty agreeing that, for the simple reason that part of their argument against Assange has been that he's not an American, therefore he doesn't enjoy the freedom of the First Amendment. So this is quite a fascinating new point that the Americans may be hard put to answer, and if they're hard put, the case goes to appeal immediately.
Mr. Robertson, you've got a more friendly government to your cause, if I can put it that way, with the Albanese government, and they have been raising this issue with the Biden administration. Even a bipartisan group of politicians travelled to Washington to raise Julian Assange's case. Do you think Albanese should be doing more? Well,
I think he was right to say that it's gone on long enough. And many people, whether they like Assange or not, would heartily agree with that. I remember advising a chap called David Hicks years ago, and the deal was, when the Howard government finally did something to help, was that he would plead guilty to a minor offence, which he wasn't guilty, in fact, but that would get him home immediately. It would save the face of the Pentagon, which is what this opposition is all about. So that is possible with Julian Assange. He's been offered, or he could be offered, what is called a plea deal, to plead guilty to a minor offence, get smacked on the wrist and sent home, home being Australia, Queensland.
Do you expect this will happen? Do you expect Albanese will be able to strike such a deal?
Well, look, I'll tell you what it's all about. Years ago, under the Obama regime, I had a very close contact, very high up. And when I first started to act for Julian Assange, he said to me, look, we don't want him in the American government. We'd have to prosecute the New York Times because they published a lot of his revelations. But the Pentagon do. And the Pentagon usually gets its man. So that's what he's up against. And there is a strong section of the Pentagon that wants to make him wants to use him as a warning to others.
Not to leak national security. Mr. Robertson, you mentioned that public sympathy is divided for Julian Assange, particularly in Australia. Does Julian Assange himself accept that his leaks could have cost lives, could have endangered sources?
This is interesting because it's a very recent, revived allegation. It was dismissed in Bradley Manning's case, Chelsea Manning, as she now is, when the CIA prosecution admitted that they couldn't show any. But British barristers now have dressed up their argument with this suggestion. But the important thing to remember, which refutes it, is that all the leaked cables were secret, but not top secret. None of them were classified as top secret, and that is the classification that diplomats have to use if there's any danger of putting lives at stake. So these were cables that were merely secret. They were shared by about 2 million servicemen, including a mixed-up 23-year-old. So they, on the face of it, on principle, could not have put lives at stake. This is a new allegation dredged by British barristers for their own
Just finally, before you go, Mr. Robertson, as one of the world's leading human rights lawyers, are you concerned about this horrific rise in anti-Semitism that we're seeing that's been virtually unprecedented since the Holocaust?
It is horrific because anti-Semitism is, in my view, the worst form of discrimination. It is subtle. It can draw people in to the most obnoxious hatreds and to violence. It is monstrous, and it has risen. Yes, it has, and it's a tragedy. But it has risen partly because of the action of the Netanyahu government, and that is something that will have to be decided in due course.
Well, I don't think you can excuse or give any justification for the rise in anti-Semitism, and you can't blame Israel for the rise in anti-Semitism. You can't blame what's unfolding in the Middle East for the anti-Semitism that we're seeing here in Australia.
No, of course. But where you have thousands of children being killed, that is one factor in the rise of anti-Semitism, illogical though it may be. So it's a tragedy in many ways.
Geoffrey Robertson, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.